So, Dr.
So good afternoon and be welcome to FLAD. We are tonight in the third session of our series on the US elections. As you probably know, and some of you were here, in FLAD, we followed the elections closely, both with the help of experts and with the remote presence of legislators of Portuguese origin were also following the election in the United States. The result, I was speaking now, the result was not such a surprise. Some of the details on the result were a surprise. So just remembering Donald Trump won the election with 312 electoral college votes, with around 2 points of percentage above his opponent. The Republicans regained control of the Senate, and probably they will have the control of the House of Representatives. So to help us looking to the following years and to the challenges that this time ahead will present us, we have with us tonight Hal Brands. Hal Brands is a professor of global affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and is also a senior fellow on the think tank American Enterprise Institute. We can also follow him regularly in Bloomberg Opinion or in his articles in the Wall Street Journal, in the Washington Post, or in the Foreign Affairs. And to help us also, we have, again, Márcia Rodrigues from RTP. Thank you, Márcia, to be with us. And to help us looking to this time ahead. I dare to present 3 points that I think European countries must have present in this time. Knowledge, vision, and will. Knowledge of the challenges that we will face, looking at it not from the usual European perspective, but trying for once to understand the perspective of the American stakeholders as well as the American people. Second, a clear vision that is missing, a clear vision of how to adapt to this new reality that is emerging from this election. And third, the will to act together that has been also missing recently in Europe. So the will to act together in Europe, both in NATO and in the European Union, looking at the economic side of it. underlying this discussion is the inevitable subject of alliances. And Hal Brands wrote about the Americas' exceptional alliances and how they can play a role in this time ahead. So we are tonight looking at the challenges that the future is presenting us, and we are doing it with the competition of the Web Summit. So thank you to be here. Thank you to have chosen to be with us tonight. And without any more remarks, thank you again. And Márcia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. So we have here Dr. Brands. And my first question is, do you believe that Donald Trump, the elect president, is as isolationist as we see it in Europe?
Well, first, I'd just like to say thanks to Flad for having me. It's really nice to be here and to get a chance to see Lisbon. The short answer is no. So Trump is not an isolationist, and I think that term misleads more than it informs us, because what Trump seems to envision is not a scenario in which the U.S. withdraws from the world. He actually thinks, in many cases, the U.S. should be using its power more aggressively than it does today. He thinks the U.S. should use its power more aggressively in trade disputes. He thinks the U.S. should be more aggressive in terms of using tariffs and export controls against countries whose policies it dislikes. He thinks the U.S. should be acting more aggressively versus Iran, for instance. And so this is not sort of a 1930s style withdrawal from the world that he envisions. I think what he envisions is an America that is more unilateral, is more willing to throw its weight around with or without allies, an America that is more transactional, in other words, that doesn't really believe in sort of these deep bonds of principle and common interest with its allies, but sort of treats every relationship as a negotiation from one day to the next. And an America that is less constrained by international bodies, whether that's the United Nations or its alliances or international law. And so that feels to many people like a more isolationist America, because that sort of America is less interested in Ukraine, maybe less interested in Taiwan, less interested in some of its longstanding alliances. But I think what worries people actually is that it would be one thing if the United States were truly isolationist. It's another thing, and this is I think what people worry about with respect to Trump, to have a U.S. that is still very powerful, very engaged, but is not seen by the rest of the world to be using that power responsibly.
So one of the things that the Europeans are waiting for is tariffs, as Donald Trump says, the most beautiful word in the English language. So we are expecting from 10 to 20%, China, of course, much more, 60%. And the question is, what would be the impact to the transatlantic relationship to treat the allies of the Americans as you treat the rest of the world?
So let me say just one word at the outset, which is that I would imagine that Trump views tariffs as negotiating tools, and he views the threat of tariffs as negotiating tools. And so Trump may be talking about a 10% universal tariff and 60% tariffs on China, or whatever the number is. That may not be his bottom line. It may be the start of a negotiation or the start of a process of coercion, whatever you want to call it, where he's trying to renegotiate the terms of economic relationships so that they are more favorable to the U.S. Now, that point notwithstanding, if the U.S. does go down the path of imposing significant tariffs on European goods, I think it'll have three impacts. One is that there will almost certainly be reciprocal moves by the European Union. And so the EU has made pretty clear that it'll do sort of dollar-for-dollar tariff increases with the United States. And so obviously that will have an impact on transatlantic trade. The second thing it will do is it will insert greater economic strains in the U.S.-European relationship just at the time you need more economic cooperation between the US and Europe, particularly to deal with issues pertaining to Russia sanctions and to the competition with China. And then the third thing that will happen is that if you do end up with some sort of fairly significant trade war between the US and Europe, it will just mean that there's less cohesion in that relationship at a time when the geopolitical threats are only getting more significant.
So let's go to the second biggest fear, or maybe the first biggest fear of most European countries, not all, but most, which is the war in Ukraine. So according to Volodymyr Zelensky, he said 2 days ago, where he was in Budapest with European leaders, that Donald Trump already called him and that told him, I really want to end the war and fast. This is according to President Zelensky. So if Ukraine is forced to accept an unfavorable peace, is this a victory to Moscow?
So let me start just by making a point that I think it's important to make in fairness to Trump on this issue. And it's interesting, if you listen to what Zelensky has said publicly, but also if you take into account what some Ukrainian officials are saying in private, they are not as pessimistic about a Trump presidency as you might imagine. And in part, that's because they don't really have a choice in the matter. But it's also because, let's just be very honest, Ukraine is not winning the war right now. And there was nothing that Kamala Harris or Joe Biden was proposing to do that would have put them in a position to win the war. And so, yes, it is important that Ukraine be able to defend itself. But what we don't want to do is create sort of a false dichotomy where on the one hand, Trump is going to sell the Ukrainians out, and on the other hand, the Ukrainians are going to win, because that was not what was likely to happen, regardless of the outcome in this election. So the push to make peace in Ukraine is in many ways reasonable, and I think there is actually some degree of consensus in the United States about the fact that under any sort of plausible peace settlement, Ukraine is going to relinquish the territory that Russia currently occupies. They're just not going to get it back anytime soon. And so then the question really becomes twofold. One is how do you get to a peace settlement, and then how do you make it stick? And if you want to get to a peace settlement, it's easy to put pressure on the Ukrainians to do that because they're dependent on the US for arms. What Trump has to figure out is how he's going to put pressure on Putin to do that, because Putin thinks he's winning right now. And I haven't seen Trump give a persuasive answer to that question yet. The second issue is how do you make sure that a peace deal isn't just sort of a timeout, a pause in the war, and then Putin gets to resume it when things are more favorable to him. And I don't think the Trump administration has fully answered that question yet either. My concern is that if you get a peace that's put together very quickly, where Trump basically just puts pressure on the Ukrainians to call it quits, that will have a negative effect on the security of Eastern Europe. It will make it seem as though aggression can pay, and that will have negative implications in the lessons that other potential aggressors draw. So I hope that Trump will be able to come up with persuasive answers to the questions that I just posed, because otherwise we could end up with a very unfavorable peace deal.
So now, as you mentioned, things are not going well in the battlefield for Ukraine, not going well at all. They lack people, they lack the right weapons. And as you mentioned, this won't be much different with Kamala Harris or the continuation of the Biden administration. So, I mean, why did not U.S. win so far? Is indeed the fear of escalation, nuclear escalation?
I think that was a significant part of it. I think part of it also was that the U.S. and frankly most countries in Europe just didn't expect the war to last this long. And so when the war started in early 2022, I think the expectation was that it would go on for a few months or perhaps a year or two, but not that we would be approaching the end of the third year of the war with it still raging at full intensity. I think the Biden administration, in fairness to them, they had to make a lot of decisions about this war at a time when they couldn't have much confidence about what might cause Putin to escalate. So if you think back to 2022, early 2023, at the time when Russian forces were in really bad shape on the battlefield, there was reportedly some indication that Putin might be considering using nuclear weapons. And you can, we can say that we think the odds of that were 50% or 5% or whatever, but they weren't zero. And so you had to have some degree of caution dealing with that. I think a fairer critique of the Biden administration is that once that point passed, they were relatively slow to update their assessment of Putin's escalation calculus, and that's part of what accounts for the position that we're in today.
So, with all those factors, with Donald Trump or any other U.S. president, Ukraine would not win the war. So, and I would like to ask you, what is the end game of Vladimir Putin? Is it a part of Ukraine that now he has militarily, all Ukraine, or beyond that?
I think Putin would certainly like to have all of Ukraine. I think he's made that fairly clear. And I think he would also like to just sort of overturn the existing the post-Cold War settlement in Europe, one that basically saw the U.S. and NATO spread its influence across the continent and Russia be pushed to the margins of the continent. If you think back to the draft peace treaties that the Kremlin put on the table in December 2021, they basically envisioned rolling NATO back to its 1997 borders, so before NATO expanded into Eastern Europe. I think that's Putin's objective. I think he will be patient, potentially, in trying to achieve it. And one of the reasons he might actually go for a peace deal is he might think that once the fighting stops in Ukraine, the West will lose interest in Ukraine. And so some years from now, he may be able to complete the conquest of that country. Just because you mentioned, whether Ukraine will be able to win or not, I think it really depends on what we mean by win. If by win we mean that Ukraine will be able to get back to the borders it had in 2014, I just don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But there is a different kind of victory. There's a victory that comes from preserving what is left of your country, rebuilding, integrating more deeply into the West. That sort of peace for Ukraine, I think, would be at least a partial victory. And I think that's what the U.S. and its allies should be pushing for.
Due to the clear danger of nuclear escalation with Russia, do you see Ukraine accessing NATO?
It's a little bit hard to imagine right now. Trump has, I believe the word he used was ludicrous when he was asked whether Ukraine should get into NATO. This was 6 or 7 months ago. And so, he is not a huge fan of NATO. He's not a huge fan of Ukraine. And so when you put those two things together, it's a little bit difficult for me to see Ukraine getting to NATO in the near term. I also think that that would be a red line for Russia in terms of its negotiating posture. And so my hunch is the best that will happen is you'll sort of kick the issue down the road a bit. And so perhaps as part of some peace deal, Ukraine will not enter NATO for some number of years, and then the issue can be revisited after that. I think it's likely to be more of a long-term aspiration for Ukraine than anything else.
Dr. Brands, the North Koreans are another factor. So we don't know what will happen in the battlefield. What do you expect? Because if they get in, and or if they stand in the Russian border, this is a clear threat to the rest of Europe, right?
It'll be interesting to see how effective the North Korean troops are. My hunch is that none of them have experienced combat of the sort that they're going to face on the front lines with Ukraine. Casualties will probably be very high. But to be honest, I think Putin views this as a numbers game. He's willing to accept very high casualties, even among his own forces. And his view is that if you just throw enough manpower at the problem, you will eventually be able to grind the Ukrainians down because they don't have enough manpower of their own, they don't have enough munitions, they don't have enough of anything. And so I don't think that 10,000 North Korean troops will be a game changer, but it's sort of just another piece of leverage that Russia can throw against Ukraine at a time when Ukraine's position is relatively weak.
All right, during this campaign, Donald Trump said several times that it is not true that he wants to leave NATO. He made that clear several times during this campaign. He just said, I just want the allies to pay more because all the burden is in the US. Is that so? Or do you see something else? Because he never liked much NATO, right? So why not? What? He doesn't get it?
I'm smiling because I think that if Trump were king of the world, the U.S. would get out of NATO. I think he really doesn't like NATO. I think he views it as being fundamentally unfair to the United States. I think he believes that the U.S. has no interest at all in the defense of Estonia or Montenegro or one of these other small European states that most Americans can't find on a map. That said, NATO is a fact, and it exists. And I don't think that Trump is going to withdraw from it because it would be a huge political headache for him in the United States because even within the Republican Party, even within the Senate conference on the Republican side, there's very strong support for NATO. And candidly, as much as Trump dislikes NATO, he likes complaining about it. And once you leave NATO, you can't complain about it anymore. And so I don't think that Trump is going to formally quit NATO. What I worry about is that he will continually devalue Article 5 by saying, maybe I will, maybe I won't defend you if you're attacked. And he may make it more contingent on countries spending 2% of GDP, 3% of GDP on defense. And so the message will be, okay, Germany, if you want to spend 1.5% of GDP on defense, that's fine, but the U.S. will not protect you if you're attacked.
Well, if he has that posture, that's Christmas in Moscow.
Yeah, so it's certainly not good for deterrence on the alliance's eastern front. I will say, I think the two things are worth keeping in mind. One is that the practical effect of making U.S. defense guarantees contingent on high levels of military spending could be limited because the countries that are most exposed to Russian power are also, in many cases, the countries that spend the most on defense within NATO. So, Poland wouldn't have anything to worry about. They're spending northward of 3% of GDP on defense already. The second thing is I think actually there are some interesting dilemmas that a Trump presidency presents for somebody like Vladimir Putin. On the one hand, it's great for Russia because Trump creates lots of dissension within U.S. alliances. There will be rifts within NATO, and that's music to Putin's ears. On the other hand, Trump is just far less predictable than another U.S. president. And so Putin may think that Trump plays to his advantage over the long term, but in the short term, can he really be sure what Putin will do if Russia attacks a NATO member? I don't know. And so Trump may derive some deterrence benefit out of that uncertainty, even if over the long term, I think his style of governing is genuinely quite bad for U.S. alliances.
Well, Trump likes to play strong, right?
Yeah.
So not weak. But the effect of that, if he diminishes the importance of NATO, what effect will that have in the other alliances like AUKUS, the allies in Asia?
I was in Japan earlier this year, and this was probably in March maybe, and I was asking a number of my contacts there in and out of government, what about the United States most worries you right now? And I was expecting that they were going to say, status of Taiwan or Middle East issues or maybe Trump getting reelected. And what they all said is the thing that worried them the most was that Congress would not appropriate more aid for Ukraine. And I asked why, and they said that they view Ukraine as being a test case of U.S. commitment and U.S. leadership. And they worry that when U.S. commitment and U.S. leadership start to wane, they won't just wane in one place, they'll wane in a bunch of places at the same time. And so I think there would be a lot of concern, even in East Asia or in the Persian Gulf or other places where the U.S. has important relationships, if the United States really was to fundamentally reevaluate its alliance relationship with Europe, or even if it was to simply abandon Ukraine, because there is a certain interdependence of commitments in these regions, and I think U.S. allies understand that.
So let's talk alliances. Russia alliance with China, they call it partnership, it seems to be irrelevant, the alliance with North Korea, now the alliance with Iran. Did U.S. underestimate its potential?
So there's been a fun game in Washington of trying to name these relationships because they don't look exactly like any set of alliance relationships the U.S. has. And so people have called it the new axis of evil, the axis of upheaval. A former national security advisor, Stephen Hadley, just wrote a piece calling them the axis of losers. And so, you know, it doesn't really matter what you call it. These relationships are real, and they have real effects. And if you don't believe me, just think about how much harder it would have been for Russia to keep fighting in Ukraine if it didn't have access to arms from North Korea and Iran, and it didn't have access to economic support from China. So there is a real coalition effect here, no matter what we call these relationships. And yes, candidly, observers in the U.S. and I think almost everywhere underestimated how quickly these relationships would develop. U.S. officials were not expecting Russia and China to issue their no-limit strategic partnership declaration just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They were not expecting Russia to go all in on its relationships with Iran and North Korea once the war started. They certainly weren't expecting to have North Korean troops deployed to a war in Europe, for Pete's sake. And so I think the lesson we need to take away is one of humility, in the sense that we have all been surprised by how quickly these relationships have developed, and they may continue to develop in ways that surprise us in the future.
Well, relating to that, do you believe that in Europe, it's a big saying, well, if Russia became a vassal state of China, do you believe in that? Is it a good definition for what's going on up there?
I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think it's true that Russia has become much more reliant on China economically and technologically than it was before. And I think it's probably true that that makes some people around Putin uncomfortable, because there is a long history of Sino-Russian tensions that hasn't gone away, even though the two sides are getting along pretty well right now. But the reality is that, you know, if Russia needs China, China needs Russia almost as much. Because if you're Xi Jinping and you are really worried about potentially finding yourself in a crisis or even a conflict with the United States and its allies in Asia, you absolutely have to have a friendly Russia on your border, right? China understands that one of the reasons the Soviet Union lost the Cold War is it ended up fighting on two fronts, against NATO in Europe and against China in Asia. And he is determined not to make that same mistake. So that actually gives Putin a fair amount of leverage in the relationship. And so yes, there'll be a greater degree of Russian technological and economic dependency, but there's a strategic dependency of China upon Russia as well.
All right. And there is another country in that axis, which is Iran. There is another huge conflict in the Middle East. What do you believe that should be the strategy of the U.S. Toward that conflict?
So I think that over the past year, what the Biden administration has tried to do is support Israel, support Israel's ability to defend itself, while also trying to limit the risks that the conflict would get bigger, and to mitigate to some modest degree the harm that it causes to innocent civilians. And we can sort of have a debate about how effective the Biden administration has been in doing that, but I think that describes what the Biden administration has tried to do. Interestingly, the strategic situation in the Middle East now is far more favorable to the United States and to Israel than it was a year ago, mostly because of the military actions that Israel has undertaken in the past 3 or 4 months, or going back even a little bit further in some cases, where if you look at in Gaza, Hamas has not been destroyed, but it has been severely, severely weakened. The same is true of Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's been shown that the Iranian missile threat is overstated, because Israel's missile defenses, with help from the United States, can deal with those attacks. And so Iran's proxies have been weakened, its missile forces have been weakened, its air defenses have been destroyed, And so the balance of power is just much more favorable to Israel and to the United States now than it was, let's say, 8 or 9 months ago. And so the interesting question is, how will Trump try to take advantage of this? I think what he will try to do is dial up the pressure further on Iran. He will try to do that by layering additional economic sanctions on, going back to the maximum pressure campaign of his first term. The United States may try to do more to get the Houthis to stop shooting at international shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And he'll try to put enough pressure on Iran and its proxies that Iran feels like it has to accept sort of a stronger nuclear deal than the one that Trump left in 2018, or otherwise retract its influence. I think that will be the play. And there's some possibility it will work, but there's danger as well. And just the one danger I'll mention is that when Iran feels cornered, its instinct is sometimes to escalate rather than to back down. And so if you remember the series of events between the U.S. and Iran in 2018, 2019, 2020, the U.S. withdraws from the Iran nuclear deal. It puts a bunch of sanctions on Iran. Iran can't respond economically, so it responds militarily. It attacks oil processing facilities in Saudi Arabia, U.S. personnel in Iraq, and so on and so forth. And that led to an incident in which the U.S. and Iran came fairly close to fighting a major war. So there's a lot of risk in this scenario, but I think that's the path the Trump administration will be tempted to take.
Thank you. Shall we listen to the questions of the... All right. I don't know where the mic is, right? I don't know where the microphone is.
I can speak loudly.
All right.
So I used to work on the Hill actually during the Trump administration, and having experienced him navigating his powers, his role as the executive, there were some limitations. Now with the mandate, now with the presidential mandate that he has, what role do you see Congress in either maybe like blocking some of the executive actions that he has, like for example, defense budget, NDAA? What do you see, national defense authorization? Do you see that as kind of a way to kind of temper down Trump actions?
Yeah, but it will really happen only in cases where Trump is doing something that is seen to be so extreme that members of his own party are willing to do the constraining, right? And so there are a number of cases in the second half of Trump's first term, diverting money from the defense budget to build the wall on the border, where courts basically ruled, no, you can't do that unless you get authorization from Congress, and authorization from Congress wasn't forthcoming, and because one of the houses was controlled by the Democrats. And by the way, that also provided a convenient excuse for Republicans who may have disagreed with Trump to say there was nothing they could do, right? That excuse won't be there this time around. And so Trump will exert a lot of pressure on Hill Republicans to support him on these issues. And I think they'll give it to him. And so I'll give you just one example of this. You saw 2 days ago, Trump basically said, I need the Senate to allow me to do recess appointments. And so basically a way of getting around the normal appointment process. And all 3 of the key candidates for Senate Majority Leader basically said, yeah, we think that's a great idea, right? And so I think there will be relatively little constraint there. I think the constraints will come on issues like NATO membership, where there's a strong bipartisan consensus in support of it. And in fact, as you know, I'm sure, there was already an effort to Trump-proof NATO in the last NDAA by putting some language in there that constrains the president's ability to withdraw either from the alliance or sort of some of the underlying infrastructure. You'll get it, there will be another source of constraint that comes just from sort of the constraints that reality impose. And so Trump will want to do a bunch of things, but he'll also want to have a healthy stock market and a good economy and so on and so forth. And so to the extent that there is a check either on his willingness to pursue really inflationary policies or extremely harsh migration measures, I think that's where it'll come from. And then just the third thing to keep in mind is that, and this is more relevant, I think, on domestic policy than foreign policy, the Republicans have 53 votes in the Senate. They don't have 60, right? And so you get maybe, 2 reconciliation bills a year, maybe, right? And there's a limit to how much stuff you can get into those. And so I think even in the current context, Trump will be strongly incentivized to do as much as possible through executive order, just because there's a limit to what he can get through the Congress.
So next question.
One country which wasn't mentioned today was India, both economically and militarily. I know India is highly reliant on weapons and oil from both Russia and Iran, but at the same time, U.S. is trying to play India's contiguous relationship with China as another factor. I'm just curious, under this second Trump administration, where do you see India's role? Thank you.
So India and the U.S. had pretty good relations in Trump's first presidency, which is in some ways just a continuation of the longer trend where really since the George W. Bush administration, the U.S. has been making a bet on its relationship with India as being an important contributor to international stability and potentially an important partner against China, and has been willing to push that pretty far. In addition to that, Trump and Modi got along pretty well. They both are sort of populist leaders who transformed the political systems that they interacted with. And Trump was less troubled by some of the sort of civil liberties and rule of law issues that have been popping up in India over the past decade or so. So I think the expectation in Washington and in Delhi is that the relationship will be pretty good this time around as well. In some ways, the Ukraine war has had interesting effects on the U.S.-India relationship. On the one hand, I think the Biden administration really believes that India has been on the wrong side of this issue by not being more vocal and condemning Russia and by just consuming an ocean of cheap Russian oil. On the other hand, as Indian officials will tell you, Russia is no longer the country from which they buy the most weapons. And they are trying hard to diversify their reliance on Russian weapons right now because they see a heavily sanctioned Russian defense industry that's going to be having some difficult times in the years ahead. There is, I think, there are two big issues that could throw the relationship off course under Trump. One is Ukraine. And so on the off chance that Trump tries to put pressure on Putin by going after Russian oil exports, the target of that is actually going to be India, because India is the buyer of a lot of those exports. The second issue is, candidly, what happens if India keeps trying to kill people on American soil or on the soil of other democratic countries. I think the view in Washington is that sort of India has gotten the message on that, and they will be more cautious about doing that in the future. I think also the view in Delhi is that Trump will be less troubled by that sort of thing as long as it doesn't happen in the United States. But if it does, you could see a pretty significant congressional reaction, I think, that would have bad implications for the relationship.
So,
yeah. Okay. Nobody got it.
I think it's fine.
Thank you for being so clear about what NATO allies should expect from Mr. Trump, President-elect Trump. Of course, he made it already very clear when he said that Mr. Putin can do whatever he wants to those who do not pay or whatever. But recently, you had Mr. Putin congratulating President-elect Trump. But on the other hand, is propaganda machinery in the Russian TV putting out photos of the First Lady, the future First Lady, half naked or even naked, suggesting that this is just one way of the methods, of course, which we know, but also the leverage that they have. What are we to expect next? Is this understood as something, as putting pressure on Mr. Trump that many people suspect is under compromise?
I don't think that Trump is compromised in the way that it's sometimes suspected. First of all, I just can't imagine trying to run someone as undisciplined and erratic as Trump as a secret agent. That seems very difficult to do. I think really what Putin has been doing with his meddling in U.S. elections is that he simply likes to stir the pot, and he understands that the perception that Trump is under Russian influence, it fuels polarization in the United States. It pits Democrats and Republicans against each other. It fears fuels of what Trump will do in Europe. And in general, it just destabilizes the system in the United States and the West, and that alone is helpful to Russia. So that's the sort of thing I would expect to see from the Russians basically in every coming election. By the way, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. I mean, obviously the Russian electoral meddling program goes far beyond the United States. And in general, I think the view in Moscow is that anything that weakens the cohesion of the West is a good thing strategically from Russia's perspective.
Hi, thanks for your comments. My name is Gaston. I work for the Institute for the Promotion of Latin America here. And I wanted to ask you about Venezuela. In your last Bloomberg opinion piece, you mentioned that being one of the main issues that the next president will have to deal with. I was in D.C. when Trump recognized Guaido as the interim president. That didn't end up going that well. So I wonder, how do you think that he will approach this?
Yeah, and in fairness to Trump, nothing the United States has done vis-a-vis Venezuela has worked particularly well over the past 20 years. I think there's a difference of opinion within Trump world about how to deal with Venezuela. On the one hand, you have sort of the view that has sometimes been expressed by Marco Rubio and people who are close to him, which is you got to go back to a maximum pressure sanctions campaign. You put enough pressure on the regime and it'll eventually break, or it'll make concessions, or so on and so forth. And that was really the approach that the Trump administration took during its first term for the most part. There's another view, though, which is that maybe there's a deal to be had with the Maduro regime somewhere. And maybe that has to do with they agree to limit the flow of migrants to the United States, because a lot of the migration flows that show up at the U.S. southern border right now are people from Venezuela coming through other countries, and in exchange they get some relief from oil sanctions. It's a little bit early to say which of those views is going to win out, in part because it'll just depend on sort of who ends up in which spots in D.C. But I will say that there's a connection between this and the issue that we talked about earlier, which is Iran, which is that if you do go back to maximum pressure on Iran and you're taking a significant amount of oil off of the market, you're creating stress on the market unless you find another source for that oil. And so my hunch is that if the Trump administration really goes hard against Iranian oil, that will privilege the viewpoint that you have to come to some sort of arrangement with the Maduro government because you need Venezuela to be pumping more. And obviously it's hard because the infrastructure is so decrepit at this point. But I think that could tip the balance in the debate.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. And my question is, do you believe that diplomacy through the use of force, as President Trump advocates, is relevant on a chessboard where not all countries play by the same rules, such as Iran, Russia or China?
I tend to think that diplomacy and force are not opposites. They go together. And so if you want to get a peaceful resolution to the Iran nuclear issue, for instance, you probably have to confront Iran with some realistic threat that it's going to face military action from Israel or the United States or both if it doesn't come to some sort of agreement. So I think that sort of coercive diplomacy certainly has its place, even in dealing with rogue states like Iran. Or if you want to take a less extreme example, the U.S. is currently trying to convince China to decrease its economic engagement with Russia because of all the benefits that's having for Russia's defense industrial base. There's no way of getting China to do that without making some sort of threat. And the threat in this case may be the threat that you're going to sanction the Chinese banks that are involved in that trade. That's something that Trump might consider, I would think.
Thank you. How do you think that the United Nations will fare during the Trump administration?
As a general matter, Republican presidents tend to be a little bit more UN skeptical than Democratic presidents are, and I think Trump is more skeptical still than the median Republican president. I think you will see the U.S. just take a generally more skeptical view of international organizations and international agreements under Trump. That will be true of things like the Paris Climate Accords. You could see a rollback of U.S. engagement with the World Health Organization. Under some scenarios, maybe you see a U.S. withdrawal from the World Trade Organization, although I think that's maybe a little bit less likely. In general, I think Trump's view is that the terms of these organizations are unfair to the United States. They impose constraints on the United States. They make it harder for the U.S. to get its way in international affairs and to use its power effectively. And he is just sort of far less tied to these things for reasons of tradition or nostalgia or anything like that. And so that unilateral impulse that we talked about a little while ago, I think will come to the forefront in Trump's dealings with a variety of international organizations.
Hi, Mr. Brands. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for FLAD for having me. I've been following your work for many years. One of the things that I do, I am the UN Secretary General's biographer, and my question comes very much in hand with the question that we just heard. So we've seen today that one of the first cabinet-level appointments by President-elect Trump is the ambassador to the UN, which might be sort of surprising or ironic. So let's try to draw a political conclusion from this. President Trump looks at the world and looks at the UN through the prism of Israel, because his choice is someone that doesn't have a huge international relations CV, but has been a strong advocate for Israel. So I think we can draw this conclusion that he looks at the UN as a way to foster a pro-Israeli agenda or stance, at least. Thinking about this, the way he looks at Iran and trying to guess how he deals internationally, would it make sense to think of Iran and Ukraine as reciprocant bargaining chips? So dealing with Russia, let's trade Ukraine with Iran. You, Moscow, don't intervene in whatever Israel does in Iran, and I don't intervene anymore in Ukraine. Does this make sense?
I could imagine that being part of the discussion. My sense, though, is that the Russians would probably be reluctant to accept constraints on their freedom of action and dealing with the Middle East as part of a peace deal in Ukraine, in part because I think Putin feels he has a very strong hand in Ukraine right now, that basically the US and Ukraine are going to be asking him for peace, and so he's going to be in position to drive a fairly tough bargain as to what that peace entails. I do think, I think your reading of the appointment of Elise Stefanik as the UN ambassador is right. I think that Trump sees this. He believes that the UN is biased against Israel, and he also understands, because Trump is very astute politically, that putting someone like Stefanik, who will vocally and visibly defend Israel in the UN, is a good way of catering to that part of his base that is very pro-Israel as well. And so I read this appointment as much through the lens of domestic politics as anything else.
Thank you, Mr. Hal Brands. Well, my question is, since Mr. President Trump likes to make deals, that he's a businessman, and in his last administration, he likes more deals than other things. Well, my question is, will he be committed to a new agenda of making more deals, like the deal he made with North Korea by trying to bring peace, and the deal he made with Israel and other Arab countries? And will he look at the global South in the same eyes?
I think Trump absolutely views himself as a deal maker. Clearly, the deal that he is most hopeful of cutting is a deal that would end the war in Ukraine, and he's made clear that that's his priority, and I would expect to see the administration make a move on that sooner rather than later. The other one that I think is worth watching is that basically the effort to secure diplomatic normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and this is something obviously that the Biden administration has been pushing, but Trump can claim with some justification that it was his idea in the first place, that it's basically just an extension of the Abraham Accords of his first term. And so I think Trump will try very hard to get this bargain between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the benefits that come from it. There is one potential wrinkle, though, which is that one of the reasons the Saudis were willing to go for this until October 7th was that they understood that if what you want in your Saudi Arabia is a defense commitment from the U.S. in exchange for normalizing with Israel, it's far easier to get that from a Democratic president than a Republican president. Because under a Democratic president, most of the Republicans will vote for it anyways, and Democrats who may be skeptical about Saudi Arabia or wouldn't vote for it under Trump will vote for it to support their president. That calculus might change once you have a Republican president. And so if what Saudi Arabia really wants is a binding defense commitment, it could be politically harder to get through the Senate under a second Trump presidency.
Hello. Two questions very fast. One, we didn't heard you a lot about China and how is going to be the relationship between the U.S. and China from now on. There's a lot of criticism from the Republicans that Biden's administration has been too soft on China. Is it going to change, and is it going to change dramatically? And the second question is related to this one. Is that China, Russia, Iran, even North Korea are always trying to create divisions among Western allies, which is going to be a lot more easier now. So my question is, why neither Biden administration, apparently, nor Trump administration talks about this strategy that should be so obvious, how to divide China from its allies?
So on the second one, it's just not as easy as it sounds, because for all the things that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea don't have in common, the thing they do have in common is they all view the United States as their primary enemy. And they understand that the United States is going to try to find ways of dividing them. And so they're very much on guard against that. And so, whatever conflicts divide North Korea from China, North Korea from Russia, that's less than the conflict that divides them from the United States. And so I think it's just going to be very difficult for the U.S. to sort of drive wedges in these relationships over the next 5 years. It could change beyond that, but that's more of a longer-term calculation. On China, I do think the relationship will get more confrontational. Trump is clearly going to take an economic approach that is more confrontational than Biden's, right? Biden had sort of his technological squeeze on China, but it was focused and targeted. Trump is talking about layering much broader tariffs on top of that, while also intensifying some of the technological measures. And so I do think you'll get sharper tensions there. What makes it a little bit more interesting, if that's the right word, is that I think Trump is also less committed to Taiwan. He's less committed to pushing back against China in the South China Sea. He just doesn't see the inherent value of these things in the way that I think Joe Biden did. And so I don't know exactly where that ends up, but it's going to create a situation, I think, where U.S. allies are fairly nervous, because you're going to have a tenser relationship with China on the one hand, but you'll also be less certain about U.S. security commitments on the other.
Hello, my name is Salvador, and I'm a political science student. And my question is, should we be worried about the Republican control of both Senate and the House of Representatives and the White House?
I mean, I suppose it depends on whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, right? I mean, as a general matter, I think united control of government is rarely a good thing. I think it tends to bring out the more extreme elements in whatever party has control of the government. It tends to be bad for fiscal responsibility. In general, I think the U.S. political system just works better when you have some degree of shared or balanced power within it. Candidly, though, I mean, there are some issues where, just from my perspective, you're more likely to get a good outcome in the next few years under this constellation of power, this configuration of power, than any other ones. And so, one of the issues that I'm most worried about is that as much as the U.S. likes to beat up on other countries for not spending enough on defense, the U.S. doesn't spend enough on defense. It doesn't spend remotely enough on defense relative to the commitments it has around the world. And it's actually far easier to get a significant bump in the defense budget under unified Republican control of government, because if the Democrats had the House, you would have to cut some agreement where every dollar in defense spending is matched by a dollar in domestic discretionary spending and so on and so forth. They're not going to have that problem this time around. And so at least on that one issue, I think you're more likely to get a good outcome.
Hello. Well, I'm an economist. I have to put you this question. The economics that Trump is telling that he is going to assume will, for sure, increase inflation in the United States. First, do you agree with what I said? Second, if it is so, how do you believe that things will go on? Because in 2 years' term, we will have elections.
So to take the second point first, I would be surprised if if the Republicans are able to maintain control of the House or the Senate 2 years from now, almost regardless of what happens. Just the historical pattern is that the party in power loses seats in the first midterm election, and the majorities are going to be so close, particularly in the House, where the Republicans may end up with a one-seat majority, that just structurally the Democrats will be favored to take at least one of the houses. On inflation, yeah, I mean, certainly you would think that if you have, tax cuts, very lax fiscal policy combined with tariffs and so on and so forth, like that should generate inflationary pressures. I think the real question is how Trump tries to square this circle. So Trump, for all the promises that he has made, is going to be incentivized to keep inflation relatively low because he saw how much Harris suffered for this. And Biden and then Harris suffered in the 2024 campaign. And he knows that even though he won't be up for re-election in 2028, that his legacy will be tarnished if he leaves office with inflation at 6% or 8% or whatever the number is. And so I don't know exactly how he's going to square this circle. What he may be counting on is that he gets to do the fun stuff. He gets to put tariffs in place. He gets to cut taxes. And then he pushes all the hard decisions onto the Fed and basically forces the Fed to raise interest rates, criticizing the Fed for doing it the whole time. That would be a very sort of Trumpy approach to doing things. So I don't have a good answer to how he's going to work it all out, but that's one possibility.
Hi, thank you. Just a question about the strategic calculus that might be done in the Trump administration about the relations with Europe and the same with the Middle East or Asian allies. But in Europe, the situation is unraveling politically in a very complex way. And some of the important partners, rather than being stable and rich and not willing to pay their share, they may well end up with pro-Russian governments. And my question is, how can the US administration have, my question is about your comment, of course, how can the US administration be strong, be powerful and strong like Trump says, if they have such an unraveling situation in Europe, with migrants, with civil dissension, with crossroads fights, the things you're seeing even as we speak?
So my view, let me tell you my view, and then I'll tell you the view of at least some people around Trump. So my view is that would be objectively bad for the United States. The United States can't be effective in global affairs without a strong, resilient Europe that's willing to partner with it on key issues. It's sort of the traditional transatlanticist view of the U.S.-Europe relationship. I think there are some people around Trump who look at the same situation and they see all the trends that you just described and they think, great, right? Remember Rick Grinnell, the ambassador to Germany during the first term and the acting director of national intelligence? He said back in 2018 that his job as ambassador to Germany was to empower the European right, right? Grinnell may end up being Secretary of State or National Security Advisor this time around. And I'm not picking on him, but there's a significant group of people around Trump who I think would actually be very pleased if you saw sort of a political unraveling in Europe that empowered parties on the right side of the spectrum, and including some that might be considered the far right in key countries. I think that some of those folks also look at the economic situation in Europe, which is sort of soft at best, and say, great, right? This gives us more leverage in the trade disputes that are coming, because while the US will shrug off 10% tariffs from the EU is going to get pounded by 10% tariffs from the United States. And so whether the trends that you're describing are viewed as a good thing or a bad thing, it really traces back to sort of a more fundamental calculation about the role that Europe plays in US foreign policy.
Hi there. My question is about the 22nd Amendment. Is it in any way, or do you think, what is your opinion, if it is in any way possible that Trump put it at risk, or maybe even revoke it?
So as I'm sure everybody knows, the 22nd Amendment basically creates provision for members of a president's cabinet removing him from office if he's incapacitated. There is a 0% chance of this happening in Trump's second term. There was a 0% chance of it happening in the first term as well, but especially now, because the number one lesson that Trump learned from the first term is that you need to appoint loyalists to the position around you. In the first term, Trump was so new to the ways of Washington, and he was sort of dealing with a different Republican Party. He appointed people to key positions who, A, fundamentally disagreed with him on key issues, and B, in many cases, loathed him personally. He's not going to do that again. There's going to be a priority on loyalty. And so as a result of that, there's no scenario where Trump's cabinet is going to get together and decide to remove him from office.
Hello, thanks for your comments. I'd just like to add the following question. If Ukraine goes, if Taiwan goes, what will happen to the geostrategic interests of the United States in 2 to 4 years' time? Will the United States be able to negotiate anything with another country except Israel in the world stage if Taiwan and Ukraine go?
I'll say I'm not quite that pessimistic. I mean, I think the worst case scenario in Ukraine is a peace deal that won't collapse immediately. It'll collapse 3 or 4 years down the road. And even then, I think it'll be hard for Russia to conquer all of Ukraine. On the Taiwan issue, I think Taiwan is a little bit different. I think Trump cares less about it, but there are going to be a lot of people in his administration who care a lot about it. And Trump won't want the visual of being humiliated when Xi Jinping, blockades or attacks Taiwan. So I actually think the chances of the United States simply cutting Taiwan loose under Trump are relatively low. With respect to what this scenario or even sort of an unfavorable peace in Ukraine would mean for other U.S. commitments, I don't think it's a good thing. Certainly it would cast doubt about America's engagement and support of the world order that it's tried to cultivate. But what we learned during the first term is that, like it or not, countries are willing to put up with a lot from the United States because in many cases they lack better alternatives. And unless we see a fundamentally different and more energetic approach to strategic autonomy from Europe, that's not going to change in the next 4 years. It's certainly not going to change for U.S. allies in Asia, which don't even have the option of sort of an EU to try to diversify their reliance from the United States. And so these countries will be worried by the scenario that you talk about. But I think they're going to still try very hard to cut whatever deal they can with the United States and keep it as engaged as they can for as long as they can.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My question is a bit of a follow-up of the last question, but some European leaders have talked about further European integration when it comes to defense, but these efforts have been somewhat hampered, really hampered, by some skeptical leaders, namely mainly in Eastern Europe. Do you see the election of Donald Trump changing that? For example, Donald Tusk had a very close relationship with Biden. Will leaders like Donald Tusk trust the strong government of Trump more than the weak government of Macron and Scholz?
I think that's an interesting way of putting it. I mean, you will certainly, Donald Trump's election has certainly convinced Emmanuel Macron that this is the time for strategic autonomy. It's not clear how many other people it has convinced, though, because there is, in principle, there may be an agreement that Europe should be stronger and more united, more cohesive, and more independent in international affairs. But then when you start getting down to brass tacks, who's going to lead this united Europe and so on and so forth, you start to get a lot of disagreement, in part because countries in Eastern Europe fundamentally do not trust France on on issues of European security. And so my hunch is that when it comes down to it, unless the United States actually withdraws from NATO, most NATO members will prefer an unstable relationship to the United States to a full-on push for European strategic autonomy.
No more questions? One more question. Anizia.
We live in this world where the richest man in the world played such a crucial role in electing President Trump. Who's going to be more influential with Trump, or is there also potential for a conflict between Musk and Trump, G.D. Vance and Trump, whatever interests they represent?
Yeah, I think that the Trump-Musk relationship is really interesting. My suspicion is that it will be hard for these guys to cooperate forever, if for no other reason than they own dueling social media platforms. But for now, they both seem to believe that the other is extremely useful to them. And so Trump used Musk and his influence on the information ecosystem for good electoral purposes. And Musk can use Trump to get access to government contracts and a variety of ways of influencing U.S. policy in ways that are favorable to his interests. I do think that there's a broader thing we should take account of here beyond the Musk-Trump relationship, which is what this election showed is the importance of new media sources in reaching voters. And this was something that Trump did so much better than Harris, whether it was through social media or podcasts or a variety of other things. He understood that there are new ways of reaching key demographics, and I think the Democrats have some catching up to do there.
More questions? No more questions? All right. If there is no more questions, we're done, Dr. Brandt. Thank you.
Thank you very much.